Richard Calloway had not spoken a single word in 4 days. Not to his assistant, who left voicemails he never returned. Not to his driver, Marcus, who picked him up every morning in silence, because he had learned, after 3 failed attempts at conversation, that silence was the only language his employer currently understood. Not to his housekeeper, Elena, who left his dinner on the kitchen counter every evening and found it untouched every morning. Richard Calloway, 53 years old, founder of Calloway Industries, a man whose name appeared on 3 Forbes lists and 2 congressional donation records, had absolutely nothing to say to anyone, because the only person he ever truly wanted to talk to was buried in Maplewood Cemetery, Section D, Row 7, under a white marble headstone that read, Margaret Ann Calloway, beloved wife, devoted mother, the warmth in every room. It was December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas. Richard sat in the cold grass in front of her grave wearing a charcoal wool coat that cost more than most people's rent, his hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup that had long gone cold. He didn't drink it. He just held it because Margaret used to hand him his coffee every morning with both hands, like it was something precious, like she was giving him something sacred. And holding a cup in the cold still felt, in some broken and embarrassing way, like holding a piece of that. She had been gone 14 months. 14 months, and the world had completely lost its taste. He visited her grave every morning. His driver waited at the cemetery gate. His board of directors had stopped asking when he was coming back to full capacity. His therapist had stopped scheduling sessions because Richard stopped attending. His son, Daniel, 26 years old, living in Seattle, called once a week and left messages that Richard listened to completely, but rarely answered. Not because he didn't love Daniel, but because every time he heard his son's voice, he heard Margaret in it, in the cadence, in the laugh, in the way Daniel said, Dad, with that slight upward lilt, and it cracked something open in Richard's chest that he didn't have the energy to close again. So he sat here instead, in the cold, talking to marble. I don't know what to get Daniel for Christmas, he said quietly, his breath making small clouds in the December air. You always did that. You always knew exactly what everyone needed before they even knew it themselves. He paused. A crow landed a few graves away and watched him with startling intelligence. I was thinking a watch. But that feels lazy. You'd say it was lazy. The wind moved through the bare oak trees above him. He took that as agreement. He had been sitting there for almost an hour, not saying much after that, just existing in her presence. The way he used to exist beside her on the couch on Sunday mornings, comfortable in shared silence, when he heard footsteps in the grass. Small footsteps, careful ones, like someone trying not to disturb the quiet. He didn't look up at first. Then something appeared at the edge of his vision. A small hand, placing a single yellow daisy against the base of Margaret's headstone. Richard looked up slowly. A little girl stood before him. She was perhaps 6 or 7 years old, with 2 lopsided pigtails, a red wool coat with the left button missing, and boots that had a cartoon bear on each toe. She was looking at the headstone with an expression that was remarkably serious for someone her age, the kind of expression children only wear when they've been acquainted with grief too early. She didn't look at Richard right away. She looked at the name on the headstone, moved her lips slightly like she was reading it to herself, and then placed her small palm flat against the marble for just a moment, a gesture so tender and instinctive that Richard felt something shift painfully behind his sternum. Then she looked at him. She was pretty, the girl said, nodding toward the small oval photograph etched into the headstone. Margaret smiling. Summer somewhere, her hair down. Richard cleared his throat. Yes, he said. She was. Did she like yellow flowers? He thought about it, really thought about it. She liked all flowers, he said, but yellow ones were her favorite. She said they looked like little pieces of sun. The girl seemed satisfied with this. She looked back at the grave. My grandpa is over there, she said, pointing vaguely to the left. He liked root beer and baseball. I bring him a baseball card sometimes, but Mama says he can't actually use it. She paused. I think he can, though. I think he knows. Richard looked at her for a long moment. I think so, too, he said. She finally sat down. Not nearby, right beside him, close enough that her small red coat sleeve touched his arm, with the complete and fearless comfort of a child who hasn't yet learned to calculate. The social risk of sitting next to a stranger. She tucked her boots underneath her and looked out at the row of graves, like they were old neighbors. "Are you sad?" she asked. "Yes," Richard said. He didn't soften it. Something about her directness made softening it feel dishonest. "Me too sometimes," she said. "Mama says sad is just love with nowhere to go." Richard said nothing for a moment. He looked down at his cold coffee cup. He turned her mother's words over in his mind the way you turn a coin over to look at the other side. And something about the weight of it, the simple and absolute truth of it, made his eyes burn in a way they hadn't in weeks. He had read grief books. He had sat across from a therapist with a PhD from Georgetown. He had been given frameworks and stages and coping mechanisms. And this woman, whoever she was, had distilled it into 9 words that landed in the center of his chest like a stone dropped into still water. "Sad is just love with nowhere to go." "Your mama is smart," he said, his voice slightly uneven. "She's the smartest," the girl said simply. Footsteps approached then, quicker, adult ones, and a woman appeared around the row of headstones, slightly breathless, holding the hand of another little girl who was identical to the first in every feature but wore a blue coat instead of red. "Lily, I told you not to wander." The woman stopped when she saw Richard. She was in her mid-30s, with dark circles under her eyes that no amount of sleep would fully cure, wearing a coat that wasn't quite thick enough for the weather. She looked at her daughter, then at Richard, then back at her daughter with an expression that mixed relief with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry." I turned around for 2 seconds. "She wasn't bothering me," Richard said. He meant it. The woman exhaled. "Lily, come here, baby." But Lily didn't move immediately. She looked at Richard one more time. "What was her name?" she asked, nodding at the grave. "Margaret," he said. Lily nodded as though filing this away carefully. "I'll remember," she said. And then she got up and went to her mother, the woman, whose name Richard didn't yet know, looked at him with an expression that was equal parts apology and exhaustion and something else, something quieter and more complicated underneath. "I'm sorry," she said again. "She does this. She sees someone sitting alone and she stopped. She just goes." "Please don't apologize for her," Richard said. He looked at the yellow daisy against Margaret's headstone. She brought her a flower. The woman looked at the grave. She pressed her lips together. "I'm sorry for your loss." "And yours," he said. Because Lily had told him about the grandfather, and because this woman was standing in a cemetery 2 days before Christmas holding 2 little girls. Hands and loss was written into the geography of her face in ways that only someone fluent in it could read. She looked slightly surprised. Then she nodded once, a small and grateful nod, and turned to guide her daughters away. They almost left, and Richard almost let them. But then the second little girl, the one in blue, looked back at him over her shoulder and waved. A full, enthusiastic, completely unself-conscious wave, as if she were waving at someone she'd known for years. And before Richard had fully decided to do it, his hand came up and waved back. The woman looked back when she heard no movement behind her. She saw him waving at her daughter. Something in her face shifted, not dramatically, not in a way anyone would write home about, but something real happened there, behind her eyes. She stopped walking. "We're about to get coffee," she said. It sounded like it surprised her, the way the words came out. "There's a diner about 3 blocks from here. Nothing fancy. The girls like the hot chocolate." She paused. "You don't have to." Richard looked at Margaret's grave, at the yellow daisy, at the name carved in white marble, and he thought about what this woman had told her daughter, whether she knew he'd heard it or not. Sad is just love with nowhere to go. He thought about the cold coffee in his hand. He thought about Marcus waiting at the gate. He thought about the empty house, the untouched dinners, the voicemails from Daniel he listened to alone in the dark. He thought about Margaret handing him coffee with both hands like it was sacred. He stood up. Her name was Caroline Marsh. She was 34 years old. She was a nurse who worked 4 shifts a week at George Washington University Hospital, drove a 2014 Honda with a heater that only worked on the passenger side, and had been raising Lily and Sophie, 7 years old, 7 minutes apart, alone for 2 years since their father decided that the life he actually wanted did not include the one he had built. She had not asked for anything from anyone in 2 years. She had learned to function on insufficient sleep and sufficient coffee and the specific, ferocious love she had for her daughters. which was the most renewable resource she had ever discovered. She told Richard none of this at the diner. He learned it slowly, in the way you learn things about people when everyone at the table is comfortable enough to let the conversation breathe. Lily did most of the talking. As it turned out, in an unstoppable, fascinating monologue that covered her second grade, teachers' unfair homework policies, her theory that clouds were actually giant pillows for birds, and her very strong opinion that Sophie had received 3 more minutes of hot chocolate than she did, a claim Sophie denied with equal conviction. Richard listened. He didn't perform listening. He actually listened, in a way he realized he hadn't done in 14 months, in a way that required him to be present in the room rather than somewhere 14 months behind it. At one point, Caroline looked at him across the table and said, quietly, while the twins argued about hot chocolate volume, "You don't have to talk if you don't want to. We're fairly good at filling silence. I'm finding that I want to," he said. She looked slightly surprised again. He noticed she looked slightly surprised whenever something was better than she had prepared herself for. He recognized that. He had forgotten that he used to recognize that, because Margaret had always moved through the world exactly the same way, always expecting slightly less than she deserved, always genuinely astonished when the world delivered something decent. He stayed for 2 hours. When they finally stood to leave, he paid the check before Caroline could object, and when she did object, he told her that Lily had placed a flower on his wife's grave and that no coffee or hot chocolate he purchased for the rest of his life would come close to settling that debt. Caroline looked like she might argue further, then let it go. Outside on the sidewalk, the December air had gotten sharper. Lily hugged Richard's leg with both arms. Without warning or preamble, the way children commit to physical affection, completely and immediately, no negotiating, he put his hand on the top of her head, gently, and something cracked open in him so quietly that nobody would have heard it. Sophie waved at him again. The same huge, devoted wave. Caroline looked at him. "Merry Christmas, Richard," she said. "Merry Christmas, Caroline." He watched them walk toward their car. He stood on the sidewalk in the cold, and for the first time in 14 months, he did not feel like a man who had been locked outside of his own life. Pressing his face against the glass, watching the warmth from a distance, he felt not healed. He was not healed. Grief is not a door that opens once and stays open. But he felt like someone had reached through the glass and put their hand in his. Small hand, red wool coat, missing button, bare boots. He took out his phone and called Daniel. It rang twice. "Dad?" Daniel's voice, Margaret's cadence, her upward lilt on that single syllable. "Hey, son," Richard said. His voice was uneven, and he didn't bother steadying it. "I know it's been a while. I'm sorry it's been a while." He exhaled into the cold air. "Tell me what you need for Christmas. And don't say nothing. Your mother never let us say nothing, and she was right about that, too." There was a silence on the other end. And then Daniel laughed, a wet, relieved, exhausted laugh that had 14 months of worry dissolved into it, and said, "Dad, I just need you to come." Richard closed his eyes. The December wind moved through the street. "I'll be there tomorrow," he said. He hung up. He stood there one more moment, facing the direction in which a woman and her 2 daughters had disappeared around a corner, and he thought about a yellow daisy against white marble, and 9 words that rearranged something in him quietly but permanently, and the specific and astonishing grace of a child who sees a person sitting alone and simply, without calculation, without hesitation, without waiting to be invited, goes. He thought Margaret would have loved Lily. He thought Margaret would have loved all 3 of them. He put his phone in his pocket and walked back toward the car, where Marcus was waiting. The city was loud and lit and moving. Christmas 2 days away. People rushing with bags and breath clouds and purpose. Richard Calloway walked into all of it, present for the first time in a very long time.